Adam once stood frozen to the neck in the Jordan River for 18 days straight, praying to a God who had gone completely silent, and almost no one alive today has ever heard why. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't a poetic flourish added centuries later by some monk with a flair for drama. This was a desperate man, driven half out of his mind by grief, trying to physically punish his own body into earning back what he had lost forever. After the garden closed behind them, after the cherubim took their post at the gate with a sword of turning fire, after the last warm breeze of Eden touched their skin for the final time, Adam and Eve wandered the harsh new earth for 7 days, eating nothing, finding nothing, understanding for the first time in their existence what it meant to be hungry and have no answer for it. On the 8th day, driven half mad by hunger, they searched for the kind of food they had known in paradise and found only thorns, only bitter grass, only a world that no longer recognized them as its rightful lords. It was Adam who finally spoke the plan aloud, his voice raw with grief. "Let us do penance," he said to Eve, "for perhaps the Lord of all will hear us and have mercy, and give us something better than this bare and hungry earth." Eve, weeping, asked how much penance would be enough, and Adam answered without hesitation, 40 days. He would stand in the Jordan, and she would stand in the Tigris, and their sorrow would rise from separate rivers like twin columns of smoke toward a heaven that had shut its door on them both. Eve entered the Tigris first, the current pulling at her as she positioned a stone beneath her feet and stood, water at her neck, hair floating around her like something already drowned. Adam walked 18 days to reach the Jordan, and once there, he called out to every river and every living creature within it, commanding them to weep with him, to join their voices to his in a single unbroken lament for what had been lost. And the waters obeyed. The Jordan itself grew still around him, as though even the river understood the weight of what stood within it. Days passed, then more days. Adam's body, no longer protected by the garden's grace, began to fail in ways he had never experienced, his skin cracking, his strength draining, his once perfect flesh now betraying him exactly as the fruit had promised it eventually would. And still he stood, refusing to leave the water, refusing to let his suffering end one moment before the penance he had promised was complete. Because somewhere beneath the pain was a hope he could not quite extinguish, that mercy might still be possible if only he suffered enough to deserve asking for it. Satan watched Eve standing alone in the Tigris and saw an opportunity too perfect to ignore, a chance to deceive the same woman twice, using nothing more than the oldest trick available to him, pure, radiant light. He knew Eve could not yet recognize the shape of her own downfall a second time, not when it arrived wearing the appearance of mercy itself. He transformed himself into the blinding likeness of an angel, his borrowed radiance so convincing that even the river around him seemed to still in reverence, and approached Eve where she stood weeping in the cold current. "Come out of the water," he said, his voice gentle, sorrowful, exactly the tone a genuine messenger of heaven might use to comfort a suffering soul. "The Lord has heard your penance and sent me to tell you, He has forgiven you both. Come, I will lead you to your husband, for he too has been told, and he awaits you now on dry land, his penance complete." Eve, exhausted, frozen, desperate for any sign that her suffering had not been in vain, believed him completely. She stepped out of the Tigris on legs that could barely hold her, following this radiant false angel across the wilderness toward the Jordan, her heart lifting with a hope she had not felt since the gates of Eden closed behind her. But when they arrived, Adam saw them approaching from a great distance, and something in him, some instinct sharpened by his own 18 days of suffering, recognized immediately that something was deeply wrong. "Eve!" Adam cried out across the water, his voice raw with alarm. "How could you be so deceived again? Where is the enemy who separated us from the glory in which we once lived? Why have you abandoned your penance?" And in that very instant, as Adam's words of recognition cut through the deception, The radiant disguise shattered. Satan's true form emerged before them both, no longer beautiful, no longer merciful, but exactly the darkness he had always been, laughing now with open and undisguised cruelty at how easily his second trick had worked. Eve collapsed to the ground the moment she understood, weeping with a shame so total it felt like drowning all over again, this time in air rather than water. Adam's fury and grief poured out of him in a single devastating question hurled at the creature who had ruined everything twice now. Why do you attack us? What have we ever done to you, that you pursue us with such relentless hatred? And Satan, no longer bothering to hide his contempt, finally answered him. An answer that would reveal, for the first time, the true and ancient reason behind everything that had happened in the garden. Satan's true form loomed over them both, wings folded like broken shadows. And when Adam demanded to know why he pursued them with such relentless hatred, the answer that came was not what either of them expected. It reached back not to the garden, not to the fruit, not even to Eve, but to the very moment of Adam's creation itself, to a grievance older than mankind's entire existence. It is because of you that I have been cast out of my own glory, Satan said, his voice stripped now of all pretense, carrying instead a bitterness that had clearly festered for an eternity. When you were formed, I was already there, already established, already glorious among the angels. And then God commanded all of us, every angel, every power, every throne, to bow down and worship you, a creature made from dust, as though you were somehow greater than beings formed from pure fire and light. Adam listened in stunned silence as Satan continued, his ancient fury spilling out now that the truth had finally been demanded of him. Michael came to me and said, "Worship the image of God," and I refused. I said, "I will not worship one younger than myself, one formed after me, one made from mere earth. I am the elder here. I existed before this dust was ever gathered into your shape. It should be you bowing to me, not the reverse." He described how the other angels who had refused alongside him were cast down with him in that same terrible moment, hurled from glory into an existence defined entirely by loss and rage. "And so God grew angry," Satan continued, "and cast me down from that glory along with my companions, stripped of the very radiance that had once made us second only to God himself. Because of you, Adam, because you were exalted above me for no reason but God's own preference, I was made an exile upon the earth, banished from the joy I once possessed forever. This is why I have pursued you and your wife with everything in my power since the day you were formed. This is why I could not rest until I had found some way to make you fall as I had fallen." Adam stood frozen at the weight of this revelation, understanding now that the tragedy of the garden had never truly been about a piece of fruit at all. It had been the final act in a resentment that began before he had even drawn his first breath, a debt of pride and jealousy that would now, apparently, never fully be settled. Eve wept harder, understanding that her own suffering, her own shame, had been merely a tool in a much older and far darker war that had nothing to do with her at all. Adam and Eve returned from that devastating encounter, changed in ways neither of them could fully articulate, carrying now not only the shame of the garden, but the crushing knowledge that their suffering had been merely a battlefield in someone else's ancient war. And yet, despite everything, despite the second deception and the bitter revelation that followed it, they did not abandon their penance entirely. Adam returned to a modified vigil, understanding now that mercy, if it came at all, would not come easily or quickly. In time, Eve conceived, and the pain of childbirth arrived as something entirely new to human experience. A suffering so total that Eve believed, in her worst moments, that she was dying, that this too was some final punishment she had not been warned about. She cried out for the Lord, and though no visible messenger appeared this time, 12 angels and 2 heavenly powers came to stand beside her in that moment, unseen but somehow felt, easing what might otherwise have been unbearable. When the child was finally born, he emerged glowing faintly, and at Eve's request, Adam went out and gathered plants from the harsh wilderness, bringing them back for her to eat and recover her strength. They named the boy Cain. A second son followed in time, whom they named Abel, and the two boys grew up together in a world their parents remembered as paradise, but which the boys themselves had never known as anything but thorns and labor. Cain worked the soil, tilling ground that resisted him at every turn, while Abel tended flocks, watching over creatures that had once lived alongside Adam and Eve in gentle companionship, but now served as mere sustenance and labor for a fallen world. Eve, watching her sons grow, often found herself troubled by dreams she could not fully interpret, visions in which blood seemed to stain the earth in ways that unsettled her more deeply than she could explain to Adam, who dismissed her fears as the lingering trauma of everything they had already endured. She did not yet know how prophetic those dreams would prove to be, did not yet understand that the same ancient hatred which had pursued her and Adam through the wilderness had already found new ground to work through, this time planted deep in the heart of one of her own sons, waiting only for the right provocation to bear its terrible fruit. The ancient hatred that had pursued Adam and Eve through the wilderness found its way, eventually, into the heart of their firstborn son, and it chose the most ordinary of occasions to reveal itself, an offering to God that Cain believed should have been received exactly as he intended it, and wasn't. Cain brought the fruits of his labor, produce grown from soil that resisted him at every step, while Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, offered without hesitation or calculation. When Abel's offering was accepted with evident favor, and Cain's was not, something shifted in Cain's face that his parents, watching from a distance, recognized immediately and with dread, the exact same twisted resentment that had once animated the fallen angel who pursued them through the desert, now wearing their own son's features. Cain said nothing to Abel directly about his anger, choosing instead to let it fester in silence, nursing the injustice until it calcified into something far more dangerous than simple jealousy. He invited his brother to walk with him into the fields one ordinary afternoon, and Abel, suspecting nothing, agreed without hesitation, still trusting his brother completely despite the tension that had settled over their household in recent days. What happened in that field would echo through every generation that followed, for Cain rose against his brother and struck him down, becoming the first human being to end another human life, a horror so unprecedented that Cain himself did not immediately understand what he had done. Standing over his brother's body in a confusion that briefly outweighed even his guilt, he watched, disturbed and disoriented, as a bird demonstrated for him what he needed to do next, scratching at the earth and burying one of its own dead companions, teaching the first murderer the mechanics of the first burial through nothing more than simple animal instinct. When Adam and Eve learned what had happened, their grief surpassed even the devastation of the garden's loss, for this was a wound inflicted not by any outside enemy, but from within their own family, proof beyond any argument that the corruption planted in Eden had taken root permanently in their bloodline. Eve wept bitterly, remembering now with terrible clarity the blood-stained dreams that had troubled her before either son was old enough to walk, understanding finally that she had been shown this horror in advance and had lacked the wisdom to prevent it. Adam, meanwhile, felt something break inside him that even 18 days in the freezing Jordan had never managed to break. A final, undeniable confirmation that the world he and Eve had brought their children into was every bit as fallen and dangerous as the angel who deceived them had always intended it to be. 930 years is a difficult number to comprehend, but that is how long Adam lived before his body finally began the slow work of dying. 9.5 centuries of watching his children and grandchildren multiply across the earth. 9.5 centuries of carrying the weight of a single choice made in a garden most of his descendants would never see. When the illness finally came, It arrived as something entirely unfamiliar to Adam, who had never in 900 years experienced sickness in this particular way. A deep internal pain that spread through his body like fire moving through dry grass, unlike anything the thorns and labor of ordinary life had ever inflicted on him. He called his sons and daughters to his bedside, all 30 of them and their descendants beyond counting, and told them plainly that he was suffering greatly. Seth, born after Abel's death to comfort Eve in her grief, asked his father directly what sickness was, since none of the children born after Eden had ever witnessed such a thing. Adam's answer carried the full weight of everything he had lost. "When your mother and I transgressed the commandment," he said, his voice weaker now than his children had ever heard it, "God divided all suffering that was to come into 72 plagues, and appointed each one to its own particular sorrow. This illness now assaulting me is merely one portion of that ancient sentence, finally arriving to claim what it was always owed." He instructed Seth to travel to the gates of paradise itself, to beg the cherubim guarding it for a small portion of oil from the tree of mercy, oil that might anoint his failing body and grant him some relief from the pain that was steadily consuming him. Eve, seeing her husband's suffering, begged to go in Seth's place, but Adam gently refused her, knowing the journey would be difficult and dangerous, and that his son's younger strength was better suited to it. So Seth and Eve set out together toward Eden, walking the same path Adam had once walked 18 days to reach the Jordan. Though this journey carried an entirely different weight, not penance now, but a desperate son's attempt to save his dying father from a fate that had been written into existence long before Seth himself was born. Along the way, a wild beast attacked them without warning, and Seth, terrified, cried out for it to leave his mother in peace, invoking the image of God in which she had been made. The beast spoke back to him in a voice that chilled them both, admitting that its own cruelty had been provoked by humanity's original transgression, before finally retreating and leaving them to continue their difficult journey toward the gates that had been closed to their family since the very beginning of everything. Seth and Eve finally reached the sealed gates of paradise, and Seth fell to his knees before the cherubim standing guard there, weeping as he begged for a small portion of oil from the tree of mercy to heal his dying father. He described Adam's suffering in detail, hoping that mercy might yet be extended to the man who had once walked this same garden in glory before everything was lost. The Archangel Michael appeared before them then, his expression neither cruel nor unkind, but carrying the weight of a truth Seth had traveled so far hoping to avoid. "Seth," Michael said gently, "do not labor in prayers and tears to beg for the oil that heals the sick, for it is not granted to you now, nor to any who come after you in this present age. That oil will only be given at the end of times, when all flesh is raised from the dead, when the great final judgment separates the righteous from the wicked forever, and when the Lord himself descends into paradise to plant the tree of life, from which that healing oil will finally flow for those who dwell in the eternal kingdom to come." Seth wept harder, understanding that his journey had failed in its immediate purpose, that his father would not be healed, would not be spared the fate that had been decreed since the garden's gates first closed. But Michael was not finished. "Return to your father," the Archangel continued, "and tell him that after 6 days have passed, his soul will separate from his body, and you will witness wonders in the heavens and on the earth and in the shining lights of the sky itself. For on that day, mysteries hidden since the foundation of the world will be revealed to your father one last time before his spirit departs this earth." Michael then granted Seth a vision he would carry back to his dying father as a form of comfort greater than any physical healing. A glimpse forward through the endless corridor of human history, showing the multiplication of Adam's descendants across the earth, their wars and their kingdoms, their sins and their occasional righteousness, until at last the vision arrived at a single distant point of overwhelming light. A promise, still centuries beyond anything Seth could fully comprehend, that one born of Adam's own line would one day undo the very transgression that had begun in the garden, restoring what mercy alone had not yet been permitted to restore through oil or ritual. Seth returned to his father carrying this vision instead of the physical relief he had originally sought. And though Adam could not be healed of his suffering, something in his face changed as Seth described what he had witnessed. Not the desperate hope of a man seeking escape from death, but the quieter, deeper peace of a man who finally understood that his story, and Eve's story, and the story of every child born into their fallen bloodline, was not yet finished, and would not end simply with his own approaching death. 6 days after Seth returned with Michael's vision, exactly as the Archangel had foretold, Adam's condition finally reached its end. His children gathered around him one final time, and the moment of his passing was unlike anything any of them had witnessed before. For the heavens themselves seemed to respond to the departure of the first man ever formed from the earth's own dust. The sun and moon and stars grew dark for 7 days, as though creation itself paused to acknowledge what was ending. Eve and Seth looked up and saw the heavens opened, and Adam's soul rising, delivered directly into the hands of the Archangel Michael, who carried it toward the presence of God for judgment, and ultimately for rest. The angels who witnessed this offered incense and prayer on Adam's behalf, and even God himself, according to what was witnessed and passed down, wept openly at the sight of Adam's body, lying lifeless upon the earth, moved by compassion for the very creature whose fall had once caused such cosmic upheaval. God commanded that Adam's body be prepared for burial with full honor, and Michael and another archangel wrapped him in fine linens, anointing him with the very oils and spices that Seth had once been refused at the gates of paradise. Granted now not to heal the living, but to honor the dead, they buried Adam in the earth from which he had first been formed, in the very place where God had commanded, and Abel's long unburied body, kept apart from the earth all these years because Adam had not known the proper way to bury him, was finally laid to rest beside his father in that same sacred ground. Eve did not long survive her husband, and as her own death approached, she gathered her surviving children and grandchildren around her, telling them plainly of everything that had happened since the garden, the deception, the exile, the second deception by the false angel, the murder of one son by another, the entire painful history that had shaped their family from its very beginning. She instructed them to write these things down on tablets of stone and tablets of clay, so that whether by flood or by fire, some record of what had truly happened would survive for generations who would come long after every living witness had passed away. And so the story of Adam and Eve came to its conclusion, not with the triumphant return to paradise they had once desperately hoped their penance might purchase, but with something perhaps more valuable still, a complete and honest record of failure, grief, deception, and endurance, passed down deliberately across the ages, carrying within it the same distant promise Seth had once glimpsed in Michael's vision, that the story was not truly finished, that mercy delayed was not mercy denied, and that somewhere beyond the reach of Adam and Eve's own lifetime, the debt opened in the garden would finally, completely be paid.